Hey guys, welcome back. So we're going to continue on and start actually coding our event system. So the first thing we should do is make that event manager object if you haven't done this already. And in its create event, we're going to make that event map data structure. We'll use ds map create and save its ID in our variable. And remember, this is where we're going to be storing all of the listeners for the different events. And the events themselves are going to serve as the keys for those lists. So that's how we're going to check if anyone is actually listening in for an event. So we look up the event in this map and we check if there are any listeners. So now, on that point, what exactly are our event IDs going to be? As I said before, there are a couple of ways you could do this, and I think it's going to depend on how complex your game is and what your events are going to be. So the simplest way is just to have your events all have unique IDs. And to do this, we could create an enumerator, which kind of lets us define our own class of variables. So let's call this enumerator event. Then in here, we can name all of our different events. So for example, we could put rain starts, rain ends, whatever. And if you're not familiar with enumerators, defining your enumerator in this way by just adding a comma to each of the entries, this is going to kind of assign a value to each of these entries so that they're basically going to be equal to chronological numbers starting from 0. So we could set these numbers ourselves, but the actual ID value doesn't really matter. They just have to be unique. Of course, if you did want to create meaningful IDs, then perhaps you could set these yourself. Now we need to create a way for our listeners to register for an event, and also attach the action that they want performed when the event is triggered. So let's create a new script, and we'll call this event register script. So whenever a listener wants to register for an event, they're going to call this script and input the event that we want to register for, then their ID, the script that they want to attach. So this would be the piece of code that they want performed when that event gets triggered. And then these are going to be optional arguments that the listener can also give if they want arguments to be passed into their script that they specified. So any further arguments will just be arguments that they want input into the script. Alright, so the first thing that we are going to need to do is get access to the data structures of the event manager. So we're going to do a lot of this inside the event manager object. So let's go with the event manager. And I'm just going to create some temporary variables so that we can refer to these a bit more easily. So var ev is going to be our first argument, right? So just the event information itself. That's how we're referencing the event. And then the object ID of the listener itself. Now, the first thing that we need to do here is check if that event has already been registered with the event manager. Because if it has been, then it should already have a place in that event map that we created. So let's check. If dsmap exists, event map, right? That's the ID of the data structure that we created. And then the key that we want is the event itself, right? Because that is acting as our reference for the event. So that argument there. And actually, let's do the case where it doesn't already exist and we actually have to create the event's place in the map. So let's actually check if it does not exist, then we need to add the event to the event map. So what I'm actually going to do is in this place in the map, right, given by that key, we're going to store another data structure. And it's going to be the list of the listeners waiting for that event. And then they are also each going to have their own information in that list. So let's make that listener list. So var listener list equals ds list create. All right, so we've created the listener list. Now we need to add that to the event map. And remember, this is basically just creating an ID of that data structure, right? So this is kind of just creating a pointer to this data structure in the map. So let's go ds map add event map ev, right, for the key. And then for the value, we're going to add listener list. All right, so it's going to create that entry in the map if it already didn't exist. But if we had already done this and we're actually not the first listener to be registered for this event, then this is already going to be created. So we haven't put any of this information for this particular listener in yet, but we do have access to the listener list, so we can go ahead and do that. But in the case that we haven't created this, we don't have access yet. So let's just go else. And we'll get access to that list. So let's go var listener list equals, and then we'll grab it from the event map. So event map, and then question mark. So this is the accessor for a map. Right, so we can just put this and then the key that we're looking for. So EV. Remember the event. All right, so now we have access to that list either way. Now we can actually go about putting the rest of this into one of the slots in this list. So I'm going to just create a temporary variable, listener info, and we're actually going to use this variable to make an array storing all of that information. So first off, we're going to add the listener's ID to the array. So we just go listener info, the very first entry in the array. I'm going to store object ID, because remember that's what we called this argument right here. So technically the object calling this script doesn't have to put itself. It could be registering another object. Most of the time you'd probably just be putting ID. All right, and now we're going to add the script and arguments. And by the way, I just want to take this moment to kind of point out, this might seem a little arbitrary that I'm giving the event map these particular bits of information, but I can only tell you that the reason I'm putting in the ID and the script and the arguments is just because as I'm making my own games, I've seen cases where I needed to access these bits of information later. And it might be that later on you want other bits of information to also be passed into the events. So if I'm ever writing a custom script like this and you don't really know exactly why I am setting it out the way I am, it's just because that is what has come up for me as being a useful function, but it doesn't mean it's the only way to make it at all. And I know it's even harder because we still have a couple other scripts to write, which is the event firing script, where the event manager is actually going to be processing this event. And it will kind of really make sense once we've gotten there. A lot of the time in programming, it's actually easier to kind of work backwards, but that would make no sense in this video, so we're going to work forwards and press on. All right. So back to what I was saying. So we've added the listener ID. Now we need to add the rest of those arguments up here. So because like I said, this could actually be variable. So we could be actually giving multiple arguments or none at all. So I'm going to actually use a loop that's going to depend on the argument count that we've given this script. So it could be just 4 or 3, or it could be 7. So we need to make it kind of vary depending on what that is. So I'm going to get that length of the argument count, but I'm going to subtract 2 because we don't need these 2. We've already dealt with those 2 bits of information, right? I only need to add the subsequent arguments. All right, so now I'm going to do my loop, and I'm going to use a repeat loop. So first off, I'm just going to declare my incrementer var I equals 0, and then I'm going to repeat by the length of the argument counts. All right, and I'm going to increment I each time. You could use a for loop here, but I just tend to use repeat loops. And now we just have to add that to the listener info. So listener info. And now what entry do we actually need here? So we don't want I because we've already put something in that entry. We've already dealt with that argument. So we want one of the next arguments. So let's put I plus 1. And I'm going to have that equal argument. And now what argument do we want? So again, we don't want I, we want to be starting from that second argument, this one right here, the script. That's the first one that needs to go in, and then all of the next arguments. So that would be I plus 2. Right, so that should get the correct places as we loop through all of those arguments. All right, and then the very last thing that we have to do is just add that array right here to the list. Add the listener info to the listener list. So ds_list add listener list, and the value that we're adding is listener info. So that will create a new place in that ds list, so it doesn't matter how many entries are already in there, this is just going to add it to the list. Alright, so that is all we need to do there. That should add everything that we need to that event data structure that we created. But now at this point, remember that we have created a bunch of data structures. And if you haven't used these before, you should know that unlike other variables that get deleted from objects, when those objects get deleted and that memory that was reserved for that variable is freed. But that is not the case with data structures, and we actually have to manage those ourselves. So we need to make sure that we're deleting all of those lists and the map that we created. So we need to come back to our event manager, and we're going to add an event, clean up, and here we want to destroy that map. So let's go ds map destroy event map. And now that is only going to be destroying the event map. What about all of those lists that we created? And actually, we might have a varying number of lists, and we don't really have nice variables to refer to them as. We just know that they're in the map somewhere. So we could loop through the map and delete all of the lists, but there is actually a function that we can use called dsMapAddList. And this is, as it says, designed for being used with JSON files. But we can still use this because it says if a DS map has a list added in this way, then destroying the parent map will also destroy the contained lists and free their memory. So this will actually clean it up for us, so long as we add the list to the map using this function instead of dsMapAdd. So let's do that. All right, that should be it. Now the next thing we have to do is create another script, event fire. And this will just take one argument, the event that we're actually firing. So now remember, this is the script that a lot of different objects are actually going to be firing in your game. So you're probably going to have a lot of events going at once, but a lot of the time, if it doesn't have any listeners, no one's actually going to care and that event will just be discarded. So the first thing that we're going to do is go again with the event manager, because we need to be dealing with that data structure again. And what we have to do here is check if there actually is an entry in the event map for this event, because that means that there are listeners for it. So again, I'm going to use a temporary variable to refer to the event. So var ev equals argument 0. And now what we have to do is check if there is an event entry. So let's check the DS map. So if DS map exists in the event map with the key ev, then we are going to get the listeners. So we're going to get that listener list again. So var listener list equals event map, and we'll access that with our question mark accessor, and ev is the key. All right, so we've got the listener list. Now, since that event has happened, all those listeners will want their actions or the scripts that they inputted into here to be fired. So we're going to have to loop through this listener list and then fire all of the events. So first off, so that we know how many times we're looping, we're going to need the length of that list. So let's get var len equals dslist size listener list. All right. And now I just want to create a few temporary variables that we're going to be using in the loop. So listener info, which is going to hold that array for the listener that we're currently working on, the listener ID themselves, the script, and then the arguments to put into that script, if any. All right, and now for our loop, var I equals 0, and we're going to repeat by the length or the size of the list. And of course, every time we loop, we'll be incrementing I. So first we need to get that listener info array out of the DS list. So let's go listener info equals to the listener list. And kind of like the map, we're going to use an accessor, except for lists, it's not a question mark, it is this line thing. I'm actually not sure what that's called. I think for most keyboards, it's just above the enter button. And then I, right? Because that will be whatever this is currently equal to in the loop. All right, and remember, this is storing an array. And in that array, remember in that first place in the array, that's where we were putting the listener's ID, right? Back in our other script. Right there. So let's grab that. Let's pull that out. So the listener themselves is equal to listener info entry number 0. All right, and the script is just in the next entry, in entry 1. All right. Now for the trickier part. Now we're going to get the arguments. So we kind of need to copy the rest of this array, and then I'm going to put it into this right here. So to do this, what I'm going to first do is get the length of the arguments. So the number of entries left in this array. So we're going to go var len args, for length of arguments, equals to array length 1d of the listener info minus 2, of course, because we already have those two. So anything that's left in that array should be the arguments. And it might be that that is 0, but if that is a number greater than 1, then we know that in fact there are arguments that we need to input into the script. So actually, let's just say if length of args is less than or equal to 0, so if there are no arguments, it should be 0, but we'll just put that for safety. Then we're going to go with the listener, and then we're going to go script execute, right? We're going to run this script. Otherwise, or else, then we're actually going to need to pull the arguments out of here and input them into the script. So I'm going to create that array in args. So args equals array create, and that array is going to be the length of this. And then the default value to fill that array, I'm just going to put 0. And then we're going to copy, so array copy. So args, that's the array that we're going to be copying into. 0 is the first entry that we're going to be copying this into. Then we're going to be copying from listener info, and we're going to start copying from entry number 2, right? That should be the arguments. And finally, the number of entries to copy will be the length of the arguments. And then, just like before, we'll go with the listener. So actually, you don't have to do this, but this is just if you want that listener running the script that it's put it in. You might be referring to specific variables in that script that only the listener can access. All right, and now I'm going to go script execute, but I'm actually going to use a different script, and this is actually a script that I have written called script execute alternative, or alt. And this script basically looks like this, and I'll put a link to this in the description. And I'm just not going to go through this because it's laborious to type out, so I encourage you just to copy paste this one. Because all it does is it will run a script and then allow you to, instead of inputting all of the arguments themselves into all the next entries, you can just give it one array, and then depending on the length of the array, it will put all of those into the script execute argument, because there's no real way to do this. Otherwise, we would need to put all of this code in ourselves into here, but using the script makes it easy. So now all we have to do is write script and then put in the args. There we go. So that should fire all of the listener's events. So that's pretty much it, except that one more thing that you might want to put in is having a way for your listeners to unregister for an event, because it might be that it's only waiting for one trigger and then we want to remove them from the event map. So we're going to create one more script. Event unregister. All right. This is going to take in an event and then the ID of the listener. So we're going to go with the event manager, just like before, and then we're going to make a couple temporary variables for those arguments. So var ev equals argument 0, and var obj id equals argument 1. And then we're going to just get the listeners from the event map as we've done before. So if dsmap exists, because we actually have to check if that entry does exist in the map. In the event map, the EV event, then we need access to the listener list, so let's grab that from the map. Listener list equals event map, question mark, EV, and your square brackets. And then we need the size of the list, because what we're going to do is actually loop through that listener list and see if there is an entry matching this ID. So we're going to do our loop now. So var I equals 0, repeat by len, and we're going to grab the listener info from the listener list, entry I. And now we actually need to check inside here, because we have to get all the way into here to check that entry for the ID. That's where we're restoring the listener's ID. So in here, we're going to be checking in that first entry, if we find that whatever listener we're currently looping through, if their ID is equal to our ID that we put in here, then we want to remove them from the list. And actually, one other thing that we have to take into account is we might be the only listener for that event now. And if we are removed, then that event doesn't have any listeners anymore and we need to remove it from the event map. So actually, let's check. If len is equal to 1, then we know that we're the only listener. And in that case, then we know that we just actually have to destroy that entire list. So ds_list destroy the listener list. And we can also delete it from the map. ds map delete event map ev. But otherwise, we can just delete our entry in the listener list. Alright, and in any of these cases, we can also break the loop because we've found kind of what we were looking for. Alright, and that's all we need. Now all you have to do is write some scripts that you want attached in your objects. And actually, I have a couple examples already. So I have my NPC objects that will pull out their umbrellas, and I also have a lighting object that will change the light when it rains. So for example, the change light script that I have will toggle a variable that will initiate the light change. But now, say that as soon as this happened, I wanted to unregister from that event. And this will actually cause a little wrinkle in the system, because if we come back to the event fire, so if it's going through here, and then as part of running their script, they remove themselves and delete their own entry, then all of the subsequent listeners will be bumped up, right? So if you were listener number 2, you're now listener number 1. And then as soon as this increments, this is going to skip you. So we need a way of perhaps allowing ourselves to unregister from an event in the middle of an event, because if you just run this script, it's going to mess this up. So instead of putting, for example, unregister from the event here, what I'm going to do, for example, as I've done right here, is get it to return true. And you might not want it to return true, you might want to set a specific value, but when this returns this specific value, what we're going to do in event fire is check when this runs and that script, if it returns true, then we're actually going to capture that value and then check it here to see if it wants to be unregistered. So that way we can actually take things into our own hands in this script and change some of the variables in here. So outside of this, I'm actually going to set another variable here. So unregister, and I'm going to set it to false. But if right here, unregister gets set to true, or here, because both of these will return the value of the script, right? So if it's true, so if unregister, then I am going to run the event unregister script for that listener. So luckily we do have those values already for the event and the listener. But what I'm also going to do is decrease I, so that it kind of cancels out this incrementer. And that should allow you to have your scripts unregister as soon as they're called. And actually another thing that we should clean up is that we might have listeners who had registered themselves but then were deleted in the game, so maybe some enemies who were killed. So in that case, this is going to throw an error because that listener won't exist. So we should actually first check if that listener exists. So if it does exist, we can do that. But if it doesn't, then we should also unregister the listener, right? Because we don't want this to happen again. So let's unregister equals true. And we'll do the same here. Alright, so finally, all we have to do now is actually add the event manager to the project. And you might also just want to make this persistent if you want this to persist throughout all of your rooms, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to drag this in here. And in my actual room, you can see, for example, these instances here. In their create event, I have gotten them to register for the event. So I've just written event register script the event rain starts, right? So the rain start event, they've registered themselves and they are going to get out their umbrella. So let's run that and see if it works. So I'm going to start the rain and we can see that our NPCs pulled out their umbrellas and the lighting changed. Alright, so everything is working and we've reached the end of the tutorial. There's a lot of work still to be done in writing the actual event scripts, and you might find that as you progress in your project, you're going to need to make tweaks to this system. But I hope this has given you a good foundation to start. I hope you guys are well, and I'll see you next time.